All right, let's dive into one of the most epic stories in European history. We're talking about a journey that spans nearly 800 years, an incredible saga of how a few small Christian holdouts, basically cornered in the mountains of northern Iberia, managed to grow, fight, and eventually create the kingdoms that form the foundation of modern Spain. This is a big one, so let's get right into it. First things first, you gotta wrap your head around the timeline here. This isn't a story about a single war or a single generation. It kicks off with the Muslim conquest in 711, stretches through centuries of fighting, alliances, and setbacks, and only reaches its famous conclusion with the fall of Granada in 1492. We are covering almost 800 years of history. So where does a story this big even begin? Well, it doesn't start with giant armies or grand kingdoms. It starts with just a tiny spark of defiance way up in the rugged mountains of the north, right after the peninsula was conquered. Now, you might be asking, how was any kind of resistance even possible? Well, it really comes down to geography. These northern mountains were cold, they were tough to control, and to be honest, they just weren't a top priority for the new rulers down in Córdoba. This landscape became a natural fortress, a perfect hiding spot for local leaders and runaway Visigothic nobles who just flat out refused to pay tribute. And that refusal, it led to the pivotal moment. In the year 722, a leader named Pelayo won a small battle at Covadonga. Now, militarily, it might not have been huge, but symbolically, it was massive. Out of this one victory, the very first Christian kingdom of this long era was born, the Kingdom of Asturias. That little spark had just caught fire. At the same time, though, over in the east, something totally different was happening. The Christian territories over there in the Pyrenees, they didn't start as independent rebellions. They actually began as something called the Marca Hispanica, which was basically a militarized buffer zone set up by the great Emperor Charlemagne to protect his own empire. So right from the start, you have two very different origin stories for these Christian states. Okay, let's move into the next phase. This is where those initial sparks really start to grow into their own separate, distinct, and often rival kingdoms during the 9th and 10th centuries. Remember that buffer zone Charlemagne set up? Well, when his empire eventually fell apart, that whole zone just fractured, and the local counts saw their chance. Suddenly, boom, you get the birth of Navarre, you get the county of Aragon going independent, and the Catalan counties start to band together. They weren't just a buffer for someone else anymore, they were their own masters. And while all that's going on in the east, the Kingdom of Asturias over in the west is on the move. They're pushing south, out of the mountains and onto the plains. And in 910, they move their capital to the city of León. This is a huge deal. It's a total strategic shift. They're not just a mountain hideout anymore. They're an expanding kingdom out in the open. Now, it's so important to understand this next part. These centuries were not just one long, nonstop war. The reality was way more complicated. You had periods of peace, of trade, even of Christian princesses marrying Muslim rulers. But you also had moments of unbelievable violence, like when the great general Almanzor marched all the way north and completely destroyed the holy city of Santiago. It was messy. But then, as we roll into the 11th century, something happens. Something that completely flips the script and changes the balance of power on the peninsula permanently. The year is 1031. And the Caliphate of Córdoba, this incredibly powerful unified state that had dominated Iberia for centuries, it simply shatters. I mean, just look at the difference here. One century, you've got a single Muslim superpower facing off against a bunch of squabbling little Christian states. The next, Al-Andalus breaks apart into all these weak, competing little kingdoms called taifas, while the Christian kingdoms are getting bigger and stronger. The whole board gets flipped. So how did the Christian kings capitalize on this chaos? Well, these new Taifa kingdoms were always fighting each other, and that weakness allowed the Christian kings to demand something called parias. This was basically protection money. The Christian kingdom started getting rich not just from conquering land, but from running what was essentially a massive protection racket. And the guy who really knew how to play this new game was Sancho III of Navarre. He becomes, by far, the most powerful Christian ruler around. And his legacy? It's immense. When he dies, he splits his massive territory among his sons, and in doing so, he creates the independent kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. And those are the two names that are going to dominate the rest of this story. So now you've got the two heavyweights, Castile and Aragon, on the board. Al-Andalus is fragmented. The stage is set for the 13th century, and a period of unbelievably fast and decisive Christian expansion. It all comes to a head in this one year, 1212. For once, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre actually put their own rivalries aside and teamed up. At the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, their combined army completely crushed the Almohad forces. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Muslim side, and the south was now essentially wide open for the taking. And after that, man, the dominoes just started to fall, one after another, so fast. Look at this timeline. In just a few decades, the great legendary cities of Al-Andalus were conquered. Córdoba falls to Castile, Valencia falls to Aragon, Jaén, Sevilla, all fall to Castile. The map of Iberia was being redrawn in the blink of an eye. Okay, so winning battles is one thing, but what comes next is maybe even more important, and it's something people often forget. How did the Christian kingdoms actually hold onto, populate, and control all this brand new territory? This is the real puzzle, right? Conquering a city is dramatic, but how do you actually turn it into a working part of your kingdom? The answer is this complicated, long-term process they called repoblación, or resettlement. And they didn't have just one way of doing it. They had a whole playbook. In the early days, way up north, it was pretty simple. Free peasants would just move in and claim abandoned land. Later on, kings got smarter. They'd set up new towns and offer special charters, or fueros, to attract people. In the really dangerous borderlands, they'd just hand over huge chunks of territory to warrior monks to defend. And finally, down in the super-rich south, the land was just carved up and handed out to the nobles and knights who conquered it. And that brings us to the grand finale. We're in the 15th century. By now, only one Muslim state is left, the Emirate of Granada, clinging on in the south. And the two Christian superpowers, Castile and Aragon, are on a collision course with destiny. And it all comes down to a marriage, the ultimate power couple. In 1469, Isabel, the heir to Castile, marries Fernando, the heir to Aragon. You probably know them as the Catholic monarchs. With the power of their two kingdoms combined, they could finally finish what had started over 700 years before. They launched a methodical, brutal 10-year war against that last emirate. They picked off key cities one by one, like Ronda and Malaga. And in a final show of force, they built an entire military city, Santa Fe, right outside the walls of Granada, just to wait them out. In January of 1492, the city finally surrendered. The 800-year quest was over. But here's the kicker, the final twist to this whole story. That famous marriage? It was a personal union of two monarchs, not a political merger of two kingdoms. For centuries after, Castile and Aragon kept their own separate laws, their own institutions, their own identities. So, the ultimate question this 800-year journey leaves us with is this. If 1492 wasn't the end of the story, when did Spain truly become one country? And that, well, that's a story for another explainer.